Archangel Michael says, 1 minute is all it takes. Open now, before you talk yourself out of giving this the attention it actually deserves. Do not close this video. Do not tell yourself you will come back to it later, after whatever else currently feels more urgent has been dealt with. Later has a way of quietly becoming never, especially for the things that matter most but do not announce themselves loudly enough to compete with everything else demanding your attention right now. This message is asking for 1 genuine minute of your presence, not distracted, not half listening while doing 3 other things simultaneously, but actually here, actually present, for just long enough to receive what is being offered. Take a breath. Set your phone down if you are holding it for any reason other than reading these words. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Whatever was running through your mind a moment ago, let it quiet, just for this 1 minute, because what follows deserves that quiet in order to actually land the way it is meant to. Notice, too, any resistance that might already be arising, some part of you perhaps wanting to skim quickly past these words rather than actually slowing down enough to engage with them fully. This resistance is worth noticing rather than automatically obeying. It often signals precisely that something important is being approached, since the mind frequently generates exactly this kind of subtle urge to rush past or minimize whatever content feels most likely to require genuine engagement rather than passive consumption. Here is why 1 minute matters more than it might initially seem to. Most people move through their days accumulating small moments of avoidance, small decisions to postpone attention towards something that actually matters, in favor of whatever feels more immediately comfortable or urgent in that specific instant. These small postponements rarely feel significant individually. A single minute not given to reflection, to honesty, to genuine presence, seems inconsequential on its own. But these minutes accumulate, day after day, into years spent skimming across the surface of a life that could have held more depth, more clarity, more genuine engagement, if only those individual minutes had been claimed rather than continuously deferred. Consider how many minutes like this one have already passed through your life without being claimed, moments where something important tried to surface, tried to get your attention, only to be quickly buried again beneath the next distraction or the next task demanding immediate attention. This is not meant to produce guilt about time already past. It is simply meant to highlight how significant this particular pattern actually is, operating quietly across an entire lifetime, shaping the difference between a life lived with genuine presence and honesty, and a life lived primarily on the surface, skimming past exactly the moments that might have mattered most if only they had been given genuine attention rather than immediate dismissal. This message is asking you to claim this particular minute fully, rather than letting it join the long accumulation of moments postponed indefinitely. What you do with it will not dramatically transform your entire life on its own. But it can serve as a genuine turning point, a moment where you actually chose presence over avoidance, honesty over distraction, even if only for these brief 60 seconds that then extend, hopefully, into the reading that follows. Consider what actually distinguishes a genuine turning point from an ordinary moment that simply passes without lasting significance. Often the distinction lies less in the moment itself, and more in what a person chooses to do immediately afterward. A turning point requires follow-through, however small, in order to actually function as a turning point rather than simply becoming another interesting thought quickly forgotten. This message, in its final sections, will offer specific guidance for that follow-through, but the foundation begins here, in this initial choice to remain present rather than continuing past these words the way you might continue past countless other pieces of content encountered throughout an ordinary day. Think about what you have been avoiding lately, honestly, without immediately rushing past the question the way you might rush past it during an ordinary busy day. Not a dramatic crisis necessarily, though it might be that for you. Perhaps something smaller but persistent, a conversation you know needs to happen but keeps getting postponed, a decision that sits unresolved because facing it feels more uncomfortable than continuing to leave it ambiguous, a feeling you have been pushing down because acknowledging it fully would require some kind of response you are not yet ready to give. Give yourself genuine space to let this question settle rather than reaching for the first obvious answer that comes to mind. Sometimes the most immediately apparent answer is not actually the most significant one. Sit with the question a moment longer than feels entirely comfortable, allowing whatever needs to surface the time it genuinely needs, rather than settling too quickly for a surface-level answer that might not fully capture what has actually been sitting beneath your conscious awareness during recent days and weeks. Whatever specifically comes to mind as you sit with this question, notice it without immediately trying to solve it entirely in this moment. Simply notice that something arose, that some part of you already knows exactly what has been avoided, even if the conscious, busy part of your mind has been quite skilled at keeping that knowledge at a comfortable distance until now. Here is something worth understanding about avoidance specifically, since it operates as such a consistent pattern in nearly everyone's life, regardless of how self-aware or accomplished a person otherwise happens to be. Avoidance rarely feels like avoidance while it is actually happening. It feels like being busy, like having legitimate priorities, like simply not having gotten around to something yet, with a vague intention of addressing it eventually once circumstances become more convenient. This framing makes avoidance remarkably comfortable to maintain indefinitely, because it never requires you to consciously acknowledge that you are actively choosing not to face something, rather than simply lacking the time or opportunity to face it. This is worth understanding clearly because it explains why simply knowing, intellectually, that avoidance is occurring rarely proves sufficient on its own to actually interrupt the pattern. The comfortable framing, busy rather than avoiding, will continue reasserting itself even after this specific insight, unless deliberately and consciously challenged each time it arises. This is not a sign that the insight itself was somehow flawed or insufficient. It simply reflects how deeply ingrained these comfortable framings tend to become through years of repeated, largely unconscious practice. Recognizing this pattern honestly, in your own specific life, is often the first genuine step toward interrupting it. If something specific arose for you as you considered the question above, ask yourself honestly whether more time, more convenient circumstances, would actually resolve it, or whether the real obstacle has always been willingness rather than opportunity. For most people, most of the time, the honest answer is that opportunity has existed for quite a while already. What has been missing is simply the willingness to actually engage with what feels uncomfortable, rather than continuing to wait for a feeling of readiness that conveniently never quite seems to fully arrive. This distinction, between genuine lack of opportunity and simple unwillingness disguised as lack of opportunity, matters significantly, because these two situations call for very different responses. If genuine opportunity truly has been lacking, patience while waiting for appropriate circumstances makes sense. But if opportunity has actually existed for some time already, continuing to wait for it, rather than honestly acknowledging that willingness has been the real obstacle, simply extends the avoidance further, disguised as reasonable patience rather than being named accurately as continued postponement. Consider, too, what specifically makes this particular thing you have been avoiding feel so difficult to face directly. Sometimes it is fear of a specific outcome, a conversation that might not go well, a decision that might turn out to be wrong, a truth that might require significant subsequent change once fully acknowledged. Sometimes it is simply discomfort itself, an aversion to difficult feelings that has nothing to do with any specific feared outcome, but rather reflects a more general pattern of avoiding anything that feels emotionally uncomfortable, regardless of what that discomfort might actually be pointing toward or asking of you. Try to distinguish, as clearly as you genuinely can in this moment, which of these two categories more accurately describes your own specific experience. Fear of a specific outcome tends to involve fairly clear, articulable concerns, specific things that might happen and specific reasons why those particular things feel threatening or undesirable. General discomfort avoidance tends to feel more diffuse, a vague sense of unease that resists clear articulation even when you try to pin down exactly what specifically feels threatening about facing the matter directly. Understanding which of these patterns applies more accurately to your own specific situation can help you address the avoidance more effectively. If a specific feared outcome is driving the avoidance, it can help to examine that fear directly, asking how likely that outcome actually is, and whether you would genuinely be unable to handle it even if it did occur, given everything you have already survived and handled successfully throughout your life up to this point. If general discomfort avoidance is the primary pattern, it can help to practice tolerating smaller doses of discomfort deliberately, building capacity gradually rather than continuing to avoid discomfort entirely and thereby never developing greater tolerance for it. Here is something else worth considering during this particular minute of attention. The cost of continued avoidance is rarely as visible or immediate as the cost of actually facing something difficult. Facing something uncomfortable produces an immediate, noticeable cost, the discomfort itself, right there in the moment you finally choose to engage with it directly. Avoidance produces a cost too, but that cost is typically distributed, spread thin across many days and weeks, easy to overlook because no single day of continued avoidance feels particularly costly on its own, even though the cumulative cost, added up over an extended period, often significantly exceeds whatever discomfort would have been required to simply face the situation directly much earlier. Think about this distributed cost in more concrete terms, specifically as it applies to whatever matter you have identified during this reflection. Consider how much mental and emotional energy has likely been consumed, quietly, day after day, by the ongoing presence of this unaddressed matter sitting in the background of your awareness. This energy expenditure rarely feels dramatic on any single day, easy to overlook amid everything else competing for your attention. But added together across weeks or months of continued avoidance, this quiet, ongoing energy drain often represents a genuinely significant cost, one that becomes much more visible in retrospect, once the matter has finally been addressed and that background energy expenditure has been released. This asymmetry, immediate visible cost for facing something directly, versus distributed invisible cost for continuing to avoid it, helps explain why avoidance remains such a persistent, common pattern even among people who consciously understand, in the abstract, that facing things directly tends to serve them better in the long run. Understanding this asymmetry explicitly can help you make a more informed choice, recognizing that choosing continued avoidance is not actually choosing the lower cost option, even though it often feels that way moment to moment, precisely because of how that cost gets distributed invisibly across time rather than being concentrated visibly into a single uncomfortable moment. Think about what it would actually require, practically, to finally address whatever you identified earlier as something you have been avoiding. Not the entire resolution necessarily, but simply the first genuine step, the one that would move this from the category of things perpetually postponed into the category of things actively being addressed, even if the full resolution still requires additional time and effort beyond this first step alone. Consider breaking this first step down further if it still feels too large or intimidating to approach directly. Sometimes what initially feels like one step is actually several smaller steps combined together, and identifying the smallest possible starting point, smaller even than what first comes to mind, can make the difference between actually beginning today and continuing to postpone, because even the first step feels too significant to approach without additional preparation first. If the avoided matter involves a conversation, the first step might simply be deciding when that conversation will happen, setting an actual time rather than continuing to leave it as a vague intention with no concrete commitment attached. If it involves a decision, the first step might be gathering whatever specific information you have been missing that has made the decision feel impossible to make confidently, or alternatively, acknowledging honestly that you already have enough information and are simply avoiding the discomfort of actually committing to a choice. If it involves a feeling you have been suppressing, the first step might simply be naming that feeling clearly, to yourself if not yet to anyone else, rather than continuing to let it operate below the surface of your conscious awareness without ever being fully acknowledged. Consider, too, what support might make this first step more manageable than attempting it entirely alone. Sometimes simply telling one trusted person that you are finally going to address something you have been avoiding creates enough accountability to actually follow through, where private intention alone might otherwise continue being postponed indefinitely without anyone else aware that a change was even being considered. If there is someone in your life who could serve this kind of supportive accountability role, consider reaching out to them soon, sharing your intention clearly enough that gentle follow-up becomes a natural part of your ongoing relationship with them. Think about the specific qualities that would make someone genuinely helpful in this particular accountability role, rather than simply choosing the first person who happens to come to mind. Ideally, this person offers genuine support without excessive judgment, encouragement without dismissing the genuine difficulty of what you are facing, and enough consistency in your relationship that gentle follow-up conversations will actually happen naturally, rather than requiring you to awkwardly force the topic back into conversation weeks later. If no single person perfectly fits this description, consider whether a combination of people, or even a simple written commitment to yourself, reviewed periodically, might serve a similar accountability function in the absence of one ideal person filling this specific role. Here is something worth understanding about why this particular message emphasizes speed, asking you to open it quickly and engage immediately, rather than the more common message about hearing something and letting it develop gradually over an extended period of reflection. Some kinds of change genuinely benefit from gradual, patient development. But certain other moments specifically call for immediate action, precisely because the window for that particular action tends to close quickly if not engaged with right away, replaced by the same avoidance patterns that have likely been operating for quite some time already regarding this particular matter. Think about why urgency specifically matters in this particular kind of situation, as opposed to matters that genuinely do benefit from extended patience and gradual development. Avoidance patterns tend to reassert themselves quickly once the immediate prompt for reflection has passed, the busyness of ordinary life reclaiming attention that was briefly, unusually focused on something typically kept at a comfortable distance. This means the window immediately following genuine recognition, like the recognition this message has hopefully prompted, often represents the best opportunity for actual action, before that recognition fades back into the familiar background noise of daily distraction and habitual avoidance. If you have identified something specific you have been avoiding as you have read through this message, this may be exactly this kind of moment, one where immediate, even if small, action matters more than extended deliberation about the best possible way to eventually approach it. Perfect planning has a way of becoming its own form of avoidance, an elaborate justification for continued delay disguised as careful, responsible preparation. Sometimes the most useful thing you can actually do is simply begin, imperfectly, immediately, rather than continuing to wait for a moment of readiness or clarity that may never fully arrive if action continues to be postponed in favor of additional planning and deliberation. Think about what specifically you could do within the next 24 hours that would represent genuine movement on whatever matter you have identified during this reflection. Not the complete resolution, simply movement, a real step rather than another day added to the accumulation of days spent postponing engagement with something that has clearly already been on your mind for some time, likely longer than you might initially want to acknowledge. Consider, as well, how you will feel once this specific step has actually been taken, compared to how you currently feel carrying the weight of continued postponement. Most people, looking back honestly after finally facing something they had been avoiding, report significant relief, often surprised at how much lighter they feel once the avoided matter has actually been addressed, even when the specific outcome of addressing it was not entirely what they had hoped for. The relief tends to come less from the specific outcome itself, and more from finally releasing the ongoing tension of continued avoidance, tension that had likely become so familiar it was barely consciously noticed anymore, until its absence, following genuine action, revealed just how much energy it had actually been quietly consuming. Try to actually imagine this relief specifically, right now, as vividly as you genuinely can. Picture the moment after this particular step has been taken, whatever it specifically turns out to be for you. Notice what shifts in your body as you imagine this moment, whatever slight release or lightness might arise even in simply imagining it. This imagined relief, while not identical to actual relief following genuine action, can nonetheless serve as helpful motivation, a preview of what awaits on the other side of finally engaging with what has been avoided for what may have already been quite some time. Think about how you typically respond when you notice yourself avoiding something specific, since this pattern of response often reveals as much as the avoidance itself. Do you tend to criticize yourself harshly for the avoidance, adding shame on top of whatever difficulty was already present, or do you tend to simply notice it neutrally, without excessive self-judgment, treating it as ordinary human behavior rather than evidence of some deeper personal failing? This distinction matters significantly, because harsh self-criticism tends to reinforce avoidance rather than interrupting it, since facing something difficult already feels uncomfortable enough without the additional burden of self-judgment layered on top of that original discomfort. Consider practicing a gentler internal response the next time you notice avoidance occurring, whether regarding the specific matter identified during this reflection or any other instance that arises in the future. Something as simple as acknowledging, internally, that avoidance is common and understandable, followed by a gentle redirection toward whatever small step might actually be helpful, tends to produce better results than harsh self-criticism, which often simply adds an additional layer of discomfort that makes engaging with the original avoided matter feel even less appealing than it already did. Think, too, about how this pattern of avoidance might connect to broader patterns already present in your life, rather than existing as an isolated instance disconnected from everything else. Sometimes a specific avoided matter reveals something more general about how you tend to relate to discomfort, to uncertainty, to situations requiring vulnerability or difficult decisions. If you notice this specific instance of avoidance connecting to a broader pattern you can recognize in other areas of your life as well, this recognition itself is valuable, offering insight that extends well beyond simply the one specific matter you identified during this particular reflection. Consider, as well, the specific words or phrases you tend to use internally when justifying continued avoidance, since these habitual phrases often reveal the underlying logic that has been allowing the avoidance to continue comfortably. Phrases like "not the right time," "need to think about it more," "we'll deal with it eventually," these often function as sophisticated justifications that feel reasonable in the moment while actually serving primarily to extend avoidance indefinitely. Notice if any of these familiar phrases arose as you considered your own specific situation, and consider gently questioning whether they genuinely reflect careful, reasonable judgment, or whether they simply represent avoidance dressed up in more acceptable, rational-sounding language. Think about what would need to be true for you to actually feel ready to address whatever you have been avoiding, and then honestly examine whether that specific condition is actually likely to arrive on its own, or whether you have been unconsciously setting an impossible or indefinitely postponed standard for readiness, one that conveniently ensures you never actually have to engage with the discomfort of taking action. For many people, genuine readiness does not precede action so much as it develops through action itself, meaning that waiting for readiness before beginning often means waiting indefinitely for something that will only actually develop once you have already begun moving forward despite not yet feeling fully ready. Here is a final consideration before this message reaches its close. This 1 minute you have given to genuine presence and reflection does not need to be an isolated event, disconnected from the rest of your ongoing life. Consider building a small, regular practice of claiming similarly brief moments of genuine presence and honest reflection, rather than allowing this particular minute to remain a singular occurrence quickly forgotten once your attention returns to ordinary daily distractions and demands. This does not need to be elaborate or time-consuming. Even a single minute, claimed consistently, perhaps at a specific point in your daily routine, checking in honestly with yourself about what might currently be getting avoided, what feeling might currently be getting suppressed, what small step might currently be worth taking rather than continuing to postpone, can accumulate significant value over time, far exceeding what a single isolated minute, however meaningful, could accomplish entirely on its own. Think about when in your existing daily routine this kind of brief practice might fit most naturally, attaching it to something you already do consistently rather than trying to create an entirely new habit disconnected from your existing patterns. Perhaps during your morning coffee, before checking your phone for the day. Perhaps during a commute, if you have one, using that transitional time for honest reflection rather than simply additional distraction. Perhaps just before sleep, as a way of checking in honestly with yourself before the day fully closes, rather than carrying unexamined avoidance patterns forward into the next day without ever having brought them into conscious awareness. Consider, too, that this practice does not need to feel formal or elaborate in order to be effective. Even a simple, silent question asked internally, "What am I avoiding right now?" held for just a few seconds before returning to your day, can accumulate significant value over time if practiced consistently. The simplicity of this practice is actually part of its strength, since elaborate practices tend to be abandoned quickly when life becomes busy, while simple practices, requiring minimal time and effort, tend to survive precisely those busy periods when honest self-reflection matters most but feels hardest to prioritize. Consider, too, that this kind of brief, regular practice serves a purpose beyond simply addressing specific instances of avoidance as they arise. It also builds a general capacity for honest self-reflection, a skill that tends to strengthen with consistent practice just as any other skill does, making future instances of avoidance easier to recognize and address quickly, rather than allowing them to accumulate unnoticed over extended periods before finally becoming impossible to continue ignoring. Think about how this capacity for honest self-reflection might benefit other areas of your life beyond simply the specific matter you have identified during this particular reflection. Decision-making tends to improve when a person has developed genuine comfort with honest self-examination, since decisions made from a place of clarity about one's own genuine feelings and priorities tend to hold up better over time than decisions made while avoiding full honest engagement with what one actually wants or needs. Relationships tend to benefit as well, since the capacity for honest self-reflection often translates into greater capacity for honest communication with others, reducing the kind of misunderstanding that often arises when people are not fully honest, even with themselves, about their own genuine feelings and needs. Before this message reaches its true close, take one final moment, extending slightly beyond the single minute originally requested, to consolidate what has emerged during this reflection. Name, specifically, the one thing you identified as currently being avoided. Name, specifically, the one small step you could take within the next day to begin genuinely addressing it. Consider, briefly, who might serve as a helpful source of accountability or support as you take this step. This does not need to feel dramatic or overwhelming. It simply needs to feel real, a genuine shift from postponement toward action, however small that initial action happens to be. The specific outcome of whatever you are facing matters less, in this particular moment, than the simple fact of having chosen engagement over continued avoidance, presence over continued distraction, honesty over the comfortable vagueness that avoidance tends to prefer. Consider, too, writing down these three elements: the identified matter, the specific small step, and the potential source of support, somewhere you will actually encounter again within the next day, rather than trusting memory alone to preserve this clarity once your attention inevitably shifts toward other matters as this message concludes and ordinary daily life resumes its usual pace. A brief note in your phone, a line written on paper somewhere visible, either option works, as long as it creates a tangible reminder capable of prompting actual follow-through, rather than allowing this reflection to simply fade quietly once the immediate impact of reading these words has passed. Trust that this minute, claimed genuinely rather than skimmed past distractedly, has already accomplished something meaningful, regardless of whether the larger matter you identified gets fully resolved immediately or continues requiring additional time and effort beyond today. You have interrupted, at least temporarily, a pattern of avoidance that may have been operating for quite some time. That interruption itself matters, creating an opening for continued engagement that would not have existed had this particular minute simply been scrolled past like countless other messages before it. Consider, one final time, what it would mean to actually honor this interruption rather than allowing the familiar pull of ordinary distraction to immediately reclaim your attention once this message ends. The next few minutes and hours matter significantly here, representing the window during which the clarity you have gained through this reflection remains most accessible, before the ordinary demands of daily life inevitably begin working to obscure it once again. Use this window well, even if only through the small, concrete step you have already identified, rather than allowing this genuine moment of recognition to simply dissolve back into the same pattern of postponement it was specifically intended to help interrupt. There is one more layer worth adding before this message truly comes to its close, something that extends slightly beyond the original single minute but remains worth the additional time it requires. Think about the specific relationship between small actions and larger transformation, since this relationship is often misunderstood in ways that make people underestimate the significance of exactly the kind of small step this message has been encouraging throughout. Large, meaningful change rarely happens through a single dramatic moment of complete transformation. It happens far more often through an accumulation of small actions, each one seemingly minor on its own, but collectively producing significant shifts over time that would not have been possible without that initial small beginning. This means the specific small step you identified earlier, however modest it might currently seem compared to the full scope of whatever larger matter you have been avoiding, genuinely matters, not as a complete solution in itself, but as the necessary beginning that makes the larger, eventual resolution actually possible. Without this small beginning, the larger matter simply continues to be avoided indefinitely, regardless of how much you might wish, in the abstract, for it to eventually resolve on its own. Consider, too, how you will handle the discomfort that likely accompanies actually taking this small step, rather than continuing to avoid it as you have been doing. Discomfort during genuine engagement with something difficult is normal and expected, not a sign that you have made a mistake or that the step you are taking is somehow wrong. Preparing yourself, mentally, for this expected discomfort can help you move through it more effectively when it arises, rather than being caught off guard by it in a way that might tempt you back toward the more familiar comfort of continued avoidance. Think about a specific phrase or reminder you could use for yourself in the moment when this discomfort actually arises, something brief enough to remember easily, that helps you continue moving forward rather than retreating back into avoidance simply because the discomfort itself has become present and noticeable. Something as simple as reminding yourself that this discomfort is temporary, and that the relief of finally addressing what has been avoided typically outweighs the temporary difficulty of actually taking the necessary step forward. Consider, as well, that this message, however meaningful it might feel in this particular moment, is not itself the actual solution to whatever you have identified as needing attention. The message simply offers an invitation and some useful framework for thinking about avoidance and action. The actual solution requires your continued engagement, beyond this single minute, beyond this single reading, extended into actual behavior over the coming hours and days. Without that continued engagement, this message risks becoming simply another moment of temporary insight quickly forgotten, joining the same pattern of postponement it was specifically designed to help interrupt. Think about how you will remember this particular reflection once your attention moves on to other things, as it inevitably will once this message ends and ordinary daily life resumes its usual pace and demands. Consider writing down, briefly, whatever specific matter and specific small step you identified during this reflection, somewhere you will actually see it again within the next day, rather than trusting your memory alone to retain this clarity once the immediate impact of this particular message has faded into the background of ongoing daily experience. This message reached you today for a reason. Trust that. Carry it with you. And when you are ready, not before, not because anyone told you to, but when you are genuinely ready, take your next step. Deep down, you already know what that step is. Thank you for receiving this message today. Be gentle with yourself as you begin turning this one honest minute into genuine, continued action.